Anybody recognize that sound? A prize for the first person? What is it? The what? Come on. No, it's not a nightingale. Right, you'll have to, the prize is over, you'll be told a little bit later, okay? But by the way, there are a number of websites that if you want to find out more information on some of the things that I'm doing. I must admit I haven't kept my own website up to date because the web manager happens to be me. So I just don't have enough time to do it. But I haven't even got all my DVDs up there. But you can find one or two things about what I'm doing there. Truth in Science, if you want to pray for me, I'm on the board of Truth in Science, which is an organization trying to lobby the education people in my country to get them to at least have just look at the evidence and not just teach that evolution is true without any evidence whatsoever. At least let's have critical appraisal of the evidence. And Answers in Genesis is another group that I'm with in associate capacity, and it's a delight to come and be with Creation Research. So it's just great to be with you these last few days. So thank you ever so much, John, and all those organizing this conference. Thank you for those working in a support role this week, Ed and Chris and many others, and of course John's wife, Anne, who's doing a huge amount of work, and others in the kitchen area. So I'm really counting it a privilege to work with you here out in Australia, and I just delight actually waking up on a morning and hearing a bird which is actually pretty vicious, but the song is beautiful. It was the butcher bird that I heard this morning, but it's a very delightful song that it has. Anyway, we're going to talk about the amazing ear that we have. We're going to talk about mammalian ears, but then I'm going to put in some things about, in particular, the human ear, right? So I want you to see that your ears are remarkable evidence, utterly, almost unassailable evidence that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, as Psalm 139 says. It is utter foolishness to suggest that the human ear and the mammalian ear, that's more general, obviously thinking of all mammals, could have evolved from reptiles, which is what evolution actually teaches. It teaches, to be frank, things which I would be ashamed to try and promote this with youngsters in particular. The idea that a reptile ear, and they say that the jawbone of a reptile combined with the existing reptile ear to make the mammalian ear. Well, I'll say more of that when we actually come to some of the issues. When we use the term evolution, we're thinking of the idea that molecules became men and that protons became people and even presidents and prime ministers. That's the basic idea that we have when we're talking about evolution. We don't mean that there can't be some changes, but those changes are not the engine for making new creatures or new devices, which is what really I'm talking about here. The real science shows that scientific experiment comes from codes, and just like codes and order come from intelligence. So let me just move on to actually show you some of the main features concerning sound. There is this verse in Proverbs 20, which refers to the ear. It says, "The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made even both of them." I want to show you that we can stand by that scripture and that the science totally supports it. We need to ask the question, though, what is sound? How do we hear? And a few words about that rather technical term, irreducible complexity. That means nothing works unless everything works, right? I'm going to show you a few things about the ear which show this to be true, that it is irreducibly complex. It won't work unless everything is working. Now, what is sound? You've actually got here And I just realized I haven't got my pointer. Oh dear, where on earth did I put my pointer? Sorry, it's in my bag and I can't. Just a minute. Oh dear, I need my pointer. I'm going to have to break because I haven't got the pointer. So obviously the streaming will have to carry on, but I must have my pointer and I haven't got it on me. Because, yeah, it's in the main room. It's in my bag in the main room and I've gone and left the pointer, and it's the only pointer I can use. I'll try and do it without at the moment. But what is sound? We need to actually just ask the question, how does sound work? It works by actually having the molecules interacting with one another and pushing against each other. We call that a compression wave because the molecules are bouncing against each other and causing compression. Air is made of nitrogen and oxygen, and the molecules are literally sending a bouncing wave all the way down from my voice to your ears, even as I'm speaking at the moment. So how do we measure sound? This is a little bit technical, but just bear with me. I'm not going to go into the great detail here because my expertise is all to do with acoustics. And some people might wonder, how can I? Thank you very much. It's in here somewhere. I've just got this pointer. Just excuse me a moment. Yeah, here it is. Got it. I just need the pointer to be able to perhaps point at one or two things on the screen. The ear is actually using sound, and I can't talk about all the anatomy. I haven't done a degree in the anatomy, but I do know quite a lot about how sound waves work, because in my work I looked at the engineering of how sound interacts with flames, which is my area, okay? So I did a lot of work on acoustics and burning, acoustics and flames, how actually you can get an engine have what's called flame out when the engine vibrates due to the combustion interacting with the acoustics, right? That was all my area. So I do know a thing or two about pressure waves and in particular acoustic waves. And it's the nitrogen primarily. And that is at 100,000 pascals, we call a Newton per meter squared. It's called a pascal, which is used here, okay? Pascal was a brilliant French physicist. So 100,000 units then of pressure. But when we're talking about the vibration in that pressure, we're talking about the vibration about roughly 100,000. And amazingly, you only need about 2 to 20, call it in on average about 10 pascals, and you've got now something you can just begin to hear. And if you're going up to 50 pascals in terms of vibration, you're already getting too loud really for your ears to cope. And it becomes painful once you get up to 65. This means that the ear is incredibly sensitive to pressure. In fact, you know that when you're in an aircraft, if the aircraft's not pressurized, it's one of these Cessna 150s or Cessna 172 or something, you've gone up for a joyride. If it comes down too quickly, then you actually can feel your ears popping. Even in an airliner, you can feel your ears popping if he doesn't quite stabilize the pressure in the cabin as you're coming down from 10,000 feet or whatever to land. So sound, we need to bear in mind these things, that sound is variation in the pressure. Then how do we hear? Now we come to the real issue about the ear. Of course, it's to do with the outer, the middle, and the inner ear. The outer ear is, of course, the bit that we see, which isn't just random. That shape of the outer ear, even if it's a bit ugly like my ears sticking out, you know, it is actually a collection device to actually bring in the vibrations in the air into the ear canal here, and this vibration in the air comes and hits the eardrum. Beyond the eardrum is, keep it on please, what was that bird? We seem to have lost the sound. Should be listening. Oh, no sound. Maybe it's there. Ah, there it is. Yeah. So what was that bird? Well, it was actually the European robin. That's the bird that it was. Now, of course, you wouldn't recognize it here, but actually it's one of the most delightful birds, very territorial, big red breast, and it's usually on our Christmas cards a lot because it's a bird which does not migrate. It stays all the way through the year in England. Come what may, whether it's snowing or what, it will be singing even in the winter time, right into the dark evenings that we have, which is really what a flute simply is. And then you get certain things which will vibrate, like this famous case of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in America. That started vibrating at its natural frequency and broke. And you can also get it with a glass like that. You can get a natural frequency. You can get natural frequencies of bridges and many other things. Why is this relevant? Because actually the ear has a natural frequency along this canal here. Remember I talked about a certain frequency that speech is at? Well, when you examine the length of this hole, it naturally vibrates at, guess what? 4,000 cycles per second, which is dead in the middle of human speech. Those of us who have rather lower voices, and my voice is fairly high for a fella, I'm more in the tenor range, but it will be somewhere, for a fella's voice, it will be somewhere in the region of 500 hertz or so. Whereas a lady's voice is going way up there, and it's be sort of more like 3,000, 4,000, even 5, 6, 7, 8,000 cycles per second. So human speech is varying right across that range, but the bit which vibrates the most, or the frequency which excites the natural frequency of that tube length, which is the ear canal, is the natural frequency is 4,000 cycles per second, which corresponds, if you want to, whoops, dear, sorry, I've gone and lost the picture, here we are. It corresponds to, if you look at the top here, this is the closed tube resonance, and if we're thinking of that, that is a quarter of the wavelength. So 2 centimeters corresponds to a wave, 2 centimeters is the length of the canal. The wavelength corresponding to that is 8 centimeters. Think now of the speed of sound. If you've got the wavelength, you can work out the frequency. It corresponds to about 4,000 cycles per second. It also is just right for the 3 times that, but it does mean that there is a natural frequency to the ear. So now, looking at the middle ear, I now want to consider beyond that ear canal, and we now come to the most interesting bit, although I would say both this and the inner ear are utterly fascinating. We've got the eardrum. We're mainly thinking of the human ear, but a lot of these points apply to the mammalian, the tympanic membrane, and behind it is a hammer which is attached to the eardrum. Now the eardrum can vibrate at, as I said earlier, at 20,000 cycles per second, but it could vibrate at 20,000 cycles per second. But any particular signal coming in could be a combination of all those frequencies. If you were to examine what I'm doing now, I'm speaking with all sorts of frequencies, and the eardrum in your ear is responding. Some of you are going to sleep with it, I know, because I have such a soporific voice, and it's coming to your bedtime, but wake up because you're actually hearing all sorts of frequencies which are going into that tympanic membrane on both sides of your brain. That hammer is then pushing against an anvil, and the anvil has the ability to amplify that signal. That then pushes against a little stirrup bone. Let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. This is the 3 bones that I'm referring to: the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. We're therefore moving from vibration in air to vibration mechanically of the eardrum, and we're going to move to vibration of this stirrup at the end. The bones that are actually moving, bones in a mammal, that just does not fit, because if they did, what are you going to do with the fact that a reptile jaw carries on growing and growing and growing, just like every other bone in a reptile? It doesn't make sense. Everything is telling you that that is just, to be frank, nonsense. That's not science at all. The ossicle bones do not grow. And there's a very good reason why they don't grow. Because we're not meant to have massive ears when we're 90. Our ears are meant to be exactly the same size all the way through our lives. Now we come to the inner ear. And the inner ear is formed in the cochlea. The cochlea has its name because of a cockle shell and the spiral shape that it has. But the cochlea is full of fluid. The fluid you can think of rather like water, but it's not water. It's actually charged fluid. It's what we call an electrolyte. And that's going to be important right at the end of what I'm saying. But you can think of it as though it was water. Now, because it's water, or something like water, it's not water, but because it's a liquid, it means that you've got now something which is at the end of those three little bones, the stirrup, pushing into a liquid. Now, if you get a bicycle pump and put your finger over the end, push the handle down, you can push it a fair way, can't you? And you can actually feel the heat generated as you push against it, because you're inserting energy into that system. Now, if you take your finger off the end, get the bicycle pump, put the handle down, put the end into some water, now pull it up again, you are sucking the water, put your finger over the end. Yes, you've got a water pistol, but I'm not talking of that, right? If you now try and put the handle in, would it go in much? The answer is no, because as you've realized, the water is what we call incompressible. Now we begin to understand what's going on with those three little bones. Now I'm going to show you this video, and while the video is playing, I'm going to give you a little bit of a physics lesson. Because in order to go from vibration in air to vibration in fluid, you've got to overcome a natural barrier. Let me illustrate. Suppose you've got somebody in the swimming pool and you want to tell them, you need to get out, time's up or something, right? And you're standing on the edge, but they're busy swimming under the water. And you say, Jack, it's time. Do you think they could hear you? No, they can't hear a sausage. Well, they can't hear your voice, right? Whether you threw a sausage or whatever. But as the sound hits the water, the technical term for that is acoustic impedance. You say, well, that's a complicated word, but you can probably understand from the way I said it, it means the ability to resist the transmission of sound. We call it acoustic impedance. In other words, any boundary is a problem. Now, supposing you were underwater and you were trying to speak, well, you wouldn't, would you? Because you'd get a load of water if you did. But supposing you tried to get the attention of somebody above the water, but you were underwater. And supposing you tried to do it by clapping underwater, well, would they hear it? No, they wouldn't, because it is also true the other way. You cannot transmit sound from the water easily into the air. Again, it bounces off the surface and goes down again. It's acoustic impedance. The surface between the water and the air acts as a barrier, and it reflects most of the sound, if not all of it. Now this is what, whoops, we stopped it. Right, we'll play it again. So this is what these bones do. They act as an almost perfect transmission device to actually move the movement of air across that barrier into movement in liquid. And there's another problem. If you have a vibration in air, it hardly makes any impact on the liquid. So you actually have to have the ability to amplify the signal. And that's what this stirrup does. This stirrup is connected to the anvil, and the anvil is actually amplifying the signal. So the movement at the eardrum becomes a larger movement of the stirrup. And this is an almost perfect system for doing it. Well, now we come to another point. Remember I said that this is a liquid, and that you're pushing against the liquid has got to have somewhere to go. So every time that stirrup moves in, this little membrane moves out. We call that the round window. So you've got the oval window to which the stirrup is connected, and the round window does this. So it's moving out as the other one goes in. Now, if there'd been an evolution of the mammalian ear, then who would have thought of the fact that you need to have a circular window to take away the pressure as the oval window goes in? You'd have just blown the cochlea immediately. And that would have been the end of that evolutionary experiment trying to make a mammalian ear. So any engineer seeing that immediately says, this is brilliant. This is somebody who knows what he's doing. Well, of course he knows what he's doing. This is made by the engineer who is none other than the Lord Jesus Christ. Do you see that already we see things which make us marvel? Here lies the finger of the Almighty, because he knew what he was doing. But we've only just begun. We've now got, this is called the basilar membrane. Now this gets very interesting, because now I'm going to unwind the basilar membrane. This is the basilar membrane inside. Now this just blows you away, because this is rather like you've got a little gremlin playing an organ inside your ear, right? This is a perfect frequency analyzer. Now, I'm speaking with all sorts of frequencies, but supposing I was singing, not that I sing very well, but supposing I was singing, ooh, right? Immediately your ear has a little green man inside saying, I need to play that note on the basilar membrane. Or supposing somebody sings a different note, la, then another little part of the basilar membrane vibrates. But if I'm using a number of frequencies, like I am in my human voice, you've got all these frequencies vibrating immediately. Now, if you know anything about electronics, it's very difficult to get a perfect frequency analyzer. You always need a little bit of the signal before you can actually analyze that frequency. Whereas the ear has a perfect system using the basilar membrane, which is rather like an xylophone. You remember playing a xylophone as a kid, right? Boom, boom, boom. But you remember that, okay? Well, that's what you got in your ear. The basilar membrane has a high frequency part and a low frequency part. And as I say, it's like a little gremlin with his little reflecting what was coming in on the vibrations on the tympanic membrane. So now I'm going to play, can we have the sound please? We're going to be playing, thank you Chris. We're going to
cochlea now uncoils and we look at the basilar membrane and now see what happens when we play individual tones. Now a chord, and finally something really complex.
Going on in your ear. You've got somebody playing toccata, bass, staccato and fugue in your inner ear. Literally, it's almost literally like playing a keyboard. This is just amazing. Just to really bring this point home, I actually did a little experiment using a digital